an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Wizard's Holiday, chapters 7.5 through 8. Local excursions and taking in the sights. In these chapters, a trip to the mall goes left, but not as left as I expected, to be honest. And Nita and Kit find out that death works differently on Alaalu. I didn't think that was allowed. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Patricia for commissioning this episode. So, I want to start this off. I'm going to jump right to the end and postulate a theory. I'm not really sure if you can even say it's a theory because it feels so nebulous. It's like not even really worthy of that title. But I'm going to give you a vague impression of what I'm thinking here. So, you know how Nita had that incredibly creepy dream? And it was all these people who were like frozen, but they were actually still alive and actual people. But they couldn't move and they couldn't do anything, but they were saying everything was fine. Do you like how I'm like, do you remember this incredibly, like, this linchpin of the book so far? So later in the second chapter, when Nita and Kit are brought to see the decision, which was to utterly reject the lone power, the lone power says something about how, like, you're making this decision in ignorance and you're going to, like, come back asking me to help someday. And I can't help but wonder if what's going on is that they rejected the lone power to such a degree that people are being kept after death because they aren't being allowed to, like, meld with the universe the way they would if you actually died. It's just a little bit too wild for me that death is just a completely different thing on this one planet, when I feel like we would have heard about this being a thing if this were common at all. And I just have to assume it has to do with the lone power and that agreement. And I think Nita's dream might have been about the spirits of the people who have died rather than what's going on with people who are alive. That maybe they're sort of frozen and, you know, in stasis. This is my, like, vague idea, is that because the lone power and the creation of entropy it's one of those things that, this is always something that I kind of struggle with, because I don't like the concepts of good and evil in general. I can understand why we go to good and evil because this is how we understand things. But it's just, for me, pretty basic to assume that something that results in death and destruction is inherently an evil thing. If nothing died, and if nothing were ever destroyed, there would be no room for new life or growth of any kind. They are requirements for growth and life to exist. You must have death and destruction. That's just part of it. Any act of creativity, you start off with, like, pieces of things, you know, and oftentimes, if, for example, you're redoing a room in your house, you have to go in there and tear walls down and destroy a bunch of it before you can rebuild in that space. So I'm not trying to say that, you know, the lone power isn't a different concept than simply destruction. Obviously, the lone power is much more complex than that. But what I'm saying is that I'm wondering whether what Diane Duane is doing here is showing that perhaps part of what the lone power has done in creating entropy is not inherently in and of itself evil, and that trying to completely fight against the lone power is actually doing like a disservice in a certain way. Like not fighting against the lone power, but trying to cheat death or fight death or loss, you know? Because, and this is also something that I sort of run into with the Dresden Files, because and I've been meaning to bring this up, but I get a little bit frustrated at the fact that there's like, you know, the summer and winter courts, and the winter court is sort of, it's painted as the more vicious and the more bent on destruction and territoriality, survival in a very primitive sense. But also what I think of when I think of winter is rest. And things die, but then there's also like things that are still alive under the surface. And this is their downtime. And things appear to wither. Things appear to die. But in fact, they've just retreated and retracted, take a breather, and eventually come back. And they're not actually completely killed. And that I feel in a lot of ways our society does not value that aspect of things. We don't like rest, you know, we are just so capitalist and productivity driven that the idea of rest is the value of it. And I say this with the full understanding that I'm as guilty of this as anybody. The value of empty, dark quiet isn't acknowledged. You know, we just really want things to be bright, full, and loud. We want life all the time. And you just can't sustain that, you know? That's just not really how it is meant to work. So, while Alaalu in a lot of respects seems like a complete paradise, I wonder if that is the downside. If there is something about constantly striving for like a positive means that the neglect of any negative is going to eventually catch up to them. If that makes sense. Yama says, that's a good theory. I did not understand the decision at all. They said no and it left just like that. It's so weird. Yeah, we'll get to that. And then she says that's the idea of Shiva. Yeah, Shiva's a really good example, actually, of just like a goddess of destruction, but in a way that is meant to be like the precursor to creation. Like, you know, like frightening, yes, but also crucial. And frightening, yes, but like you worship it because you are afraid of it, but there's an inevitability to it because of how necessary. I don't know. There's just, and this is something that I personally, like I have said, I struggle with. You guys know that I'm not good at rest. I'm taking next week off as vacation for my birthday. And it really is like hard for me to take this downtime and not plan a bunch of shit to fill that week with. Like I'm already struggling against the inclination to start a project of some kind, because that's just how I fucking always function, is I try and fill time, fill space, make myself feel like I'm accomplishing something. And I really wish that our society fostered the concept of just being without creating or doing more than they do, but it doesn't pay. So we don't, because capitalism. Listen, guys, I'm turning into like a full-blown communist in case y'all haven't been paying attention. So I just figure I may as well own that and be completely upfront about it. So, all right, let's back up and we'll talk about this book or these chapters from the start. So our crew is heading into the mall. And as they head there, they're taking the bus. And I really enjoyed this a lot. Darina's sort of watching them experience the city for the first time and how completely overwhelmed they are. Even Rashawn is having this like reaction to things and you know, he does his best to maintain his sort of haughtiness, but he can't hide the fact that he's sort of impressed here and there. And Darina simultaneously sort of like, well, they're like, do they not have colors on their planets? Like, why are they reacting to that so strongly? But she's also enjoying watching them like live all of this for the first time. And it's affording her the opportunity to see things with new eyes. And this is the sort of thing that is like the one, and I mean it. When I say the one, I know it sounds like I'm exaggerating, but I am not, kids. This is the one aspect of having children that I can understand why having kids would appeal to somebody. For me, the whole concept of children, just the overwhelming panic I feel at the mere idea of it, I cannot overstate. That said, I completely envy parents getting the opportunity to watch their kids go through something like Christmas, you know, for the first 10 times when it's still really new and thrilling. I really envy parents getting to take their kids trick-or-treating and pick out a costume and make that with them. I just envy the secondhand experiencing of things as if for the first time. And this is an aspect, in my opinion, I'm not trying to assert this in any way that's like particularly new either, but some of what we long for as adults when we're trying to reach back into our past and we have a nostalgia and we're wanting to reconnect with something that meant a lot to us, I believe a lot of what we're trying to reconnect with is actually our presence in the moment. As children, we are so focused and zeroed in on the things that interest us. And as adults, we have 60,000 thoughts that pass through our minds in the space of, 20 minutes. And it's really difficult for us to have that same sort of focus. As a kid, you don't have the kinds of cares that you do as an adult. Your mind isn't as developed as it is as an adult. And you don't have the same sorts of questions that you do as an adult. So naturally, you're going to be able to focus more easily because your mind just doesn't work the same way. But while I do want to acknowledge that all of that is like a physiological difference that is definitely unavoidable and which adults can't help, adults are also not as willing to set everything aside for the sake of being in the moment. And again, I say this as somebody who is as guilty of this as anybody. When you're a kid and you're looking at a Christmas tree, you are looking at a Christmas tree. That's what you're doing. Your whole self is absorbed in looking at this. The lights, the way that the needles look, the way that it smells. Even if it's not a real tree, still, the way that it smells, you can't help that. The ornaments and the way that those look, and you will examine them in minute detail sometimes. You will touch things. You will pull on things. You will engage 1000% with this thing because it is beautiful. It is unusual. It is in your home, which is like your space and what's it doing. And it means something significant. As an adult, we just don't stop and do that as often. We don't take a second and really be like, look at this. We'll take a second and be like, wow, look at that. And then we pull our phone out. We take a second and then we're like, hey, look at this. Look at this. And we'll talk to somebody about it and we'll point out a few separate things. But we just so rarely just stop and 100% engage in a purely in the moment, not trying to capture it, explain it, talk about it, anything. We just don't really do that because I think, believe we know already, so we don't have to. And we forget that, like, it's not about knowing. That's not the point. It's to experience because this is where you are now. This is what's happening now. Why wouldn't you? Good question. And I can't, like, I want to be able to do this more. I have been making a concerted effort recently to try and set my phone down and just sit. When, for example, the other day I had lit some candles and I was sitting in my living room and all of a sudden the sky went dark and a clap of thunder roared and then rain began to pour down. And my cat jumped into my lap and my instinct was to be like, oh my God, because she's so sweet, but she always wants attention. And all of a sudden I was like, oh my God, I always think about this exact scenario. Being in a room with rain pouring down outside, half light, a candle lit, and a cat purring. And now I have it. It's right here. It's in front of me. And I'm about to fucking shove her out of my lap so that I can go edit. What the fuck? And I had to like put my phone down and just sit. And it was wild. Guys, how different it felt. As soon as I just decided to just be in the moment, I felt like a kid. I really did. So I just really liked this. And I liked Doreen reconnecting and realizing like that she just takes for granted all this stuff. And like, you can't help that to a point. That's just life. You can't always be fully engaged and turned on like 100% because you can't live like that. I understand. But I think we could all stand to do that a little bit more often. And I don't know. I really enjoyed, I always like the concept behind creatures getting to come to our world, which is very ordinary, and taking joy in things that we take for granted. And this is something like in The Good Place as well. Michael is just all about some of the goofy shit that we would even not even just say like isn't special, but is like outright trashy. And he's just so excited about it. And it's really fun, you know? Let's see. When they asked Nita, does everyone work at your planet? Yeah. Let's see. Well, my experience is so different from what you're describing, both as a child and as an adult. Is it? I'm curious about that, Yama. Yeah, tell me. So they get to the mall, and this is what I really enjoy is how immediately they just begin to, what's that for? Why is this colored that way? You mean people actually ride on those? They should fall off, shouldn't they? Isn't that beautiful? What's that smell? Are those decorations? That was the question that got asked most frequently. Philip was fixated on the concept. Those decorations, Philip said, those look especially nice. And it turns out that he's looking at Victoria's Secret, which is great. And Doreen's like imagining a tree in a garter belt and is kind of like, oh God. But honestly, lingerie is like some of the best decoration. There's just no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's got like a wide variety of colors. There's lots of lace. There's lots of like bows and mesh and, you know, all that stuff. So like, I am 100% on board, Phil, I completely agree. And she looks up and Scarrett is like kind of booking it. He is heading over to this, like, first of all, there's a clothing display. Then he goes to this like sort of kiosk that's in the middle that's got all kinds of like gift stuff and balloons. And he winds up like buying a Mylar balloon. She says something about how like, wow, he's really got money figured out already. And I was definitely going, does he? Like, I assume he paid for it because nobody's chasing him. But there was a moment where I was like, or he just took a balloon, you know? And then there's this moment that I found really funny. 5 older kids see Rashawn and they say, hey, elf boy, nice hair. This was followed by a chorus of snickering and laughter. Doreen saw Rashawn draw himself up to his full height and turned to favor the oncoming group with an expression of truly withering scorn. "Elf boy," he said softly, "what kind of disrespectful speciest?" One of his hands moved in a gesture that Doreen recognized as the preliminary to producing some pre-designed wizardry. She gulped and hurried toward him. But Carmela merely glanced over her shoulder at the approaching group. She said under her breath, and reached out sideways to take Rashawn's hand in hers. Rashawn's eyes went wide, and he stopped absolutely still, as if he'd been frozen that way. And she then says to him, it turns out in Japanese, "Don't mind them. They're just wonderstruck by your profound majesty and glory and all that, yada yada. We don't get a lot of princes around here, and when they see somebody like you and contrast your elevated station with their tiny ant-like lives, it's really hard for them to cope." As wizards, Doreen and Rashawn had no problem understanding her. They heard the language through the speech and made sense of it that way. But the 5 guys were completely thrown off. They saw what seemed like a Japanese translator of some kind who looked at them as coolly as if they were members of an alien species, who was apparently carefully translating what they'd said for someone who looked like a living anime star, someone whose expression was better suited to the last half hour of a samurai movie than anything else, the part where things really break loose. Doreen saw faint unease ripple through the guys as they found themselves facing something they didn't understand. The guys passed close to Carmela and Rashawn, who watched them with expressions of clinical interest and complete disdain, and didn't stop, just headed on down the mall. Yeah, that's right. Move along, bitch. I just love the description of him looking like a living anime star because, I kept talking about how he sounded like Link to me, and Link looks like he's an anime character, like he's from a video game, but yeah. And I am delighted to feel like that I was validated in this sort of mental picture that I had going on with him. And also the idea that she decided to make this this speech to him in Japanese. I really that's some quick thinking that it's such a nuanced, subtle way to make these guys feel uneasiness that I'm really impressed by it. I just don't think I would ever have thought of something like that. I think it's pretty amazing that she came up with a plan that essentially just completely took the wind out of their sails in a way that also kept them from seeming like they wanted to continue the conflict in any way. So yeah, this whole thing, I love this too. She says, let's see, as they did, one of them muttered something under his breath. "Duckhead? He called me a duckhead. A duck? That's some kind of flying creature, isn't it?" Yeah, it is. They swim too. Oh my God. I didn't get that right away. Guys, what happened there? And I felt so stupid once I put it together. I was like, oh my God, they called him a dickhead. It just took me way too long. Yama is saying, as a child, I had so many anxieties, worried about all my mom's OCD things and my dad's worry about money. I was always aware I couldn't just be a child. I had to accomplish things in my life so they wouldn't be worried. I even played with my friends only because that was what was expected of me, not because I liked it or them. I definitely had this experience also, Yama. I'm more talking about as a 3-year-old. You know what I mean? Because those sorts of thoughts began to sort of come into my head around 5 and 6 years old and really peaked probably around 12-ish. But I'm talking about before you're able to put those sorts of thoughts together, that kind of being present where your entire... something is put in front of you and everything else does not exist for a second because you almost don't have object permanence yet. That kind of mentality, if that makes sense. She says, as an adult, I feel free. I have more control. And although I agree I do a bunch of things at the same time, I still don't think I can just sit down. I observe everything. I see all the tiny things and marvel constantly. My hubby did LSD once, and every time he describes it to me, I think that's my day-to-day life, and I'm sad people don't see all the things I do. Yeah, I mean, like, if I could live that way, this is the thing. I was about to say, if I could live that way day to day, that would be nice. And then I was like, would it be? I don't know. Like, I kind of go back and forth because sometimes you don't want to be able to see everything. I feel like to a point I would like that. And then there's a point at which I don't know that I would. You know, Yama just wrote true that in all caps. Because I can tend to be pretty observant, but because I have this sort of like OCD streak, observing everything is often accompanied by an anxiety to improve it, fix it, you know, or just notice that that's uneven, that's broken, there's a crack in that, that's like hanging slightly off kilter. And I wish that I could just like absorb it and appreciate it without that sort of energy. But like that kind of energy began to infiltrate how I saw things from a very, like I was saying, like 6 years old was when that sort of shit started. So I genuinely don't know that there's a way to turn that off. But that's part of why when things get set up unexpectedly to be like really excellent, like that day with the thunderstorm and the cat and everything, that I made such an effort to stop and appreciate it, because it was like, I had also like just finished cleaning the living room. So it was just like a really perfect storm of everything is actually right now about as good as it gets. And I better just sit here and savor that, you know? But yeah, this is just being in the moment just tends to be a better way to live. It's just, I don't know how it's possible to sustain it in the kind of society we've built and still live, you know? So anyway, Doreen looks up and she sees Scarrett, and he is heading up towards the food court. Doreen is pretty confident he's being drawn up there by the smell of food. And she essentially winds up like sending Carmela and Rashawn up there. Rashawn is also, after about an hour, showing serious signs of flagging. And Carmela gives him a bit of a hard time over the fact that he doesn't have much stamina. And he says something about how it's difficult to keep up this. He says, my feet do pain me, and keeping up the disguise takes a certain amount of energy. Guys, I am still curious about whether he's actually a wizard or if there is something else that he's doing in order to have this disguise. Like, I don't know what's going on with him. I just find it suspect, you know? Like, is it possible for there to be a wizard who handed him an enchantment to use, you know? But the fact that he gestured in such a way that he was about to, like, attack those guys with an enchantment of some kind, I guess he must be. Like, that wouldn't make sense otherwise. I don't know. I don't know what to make of this guy. But anyway, yeah. So he says perhaps a restorative. And this is when Doreen is like, all right, Carmela, take them to get some ice cream. And I am going to go to this sporting goods store with Philip. And it turns out she went there because every time that he seemed particularly entranced by something in a window, it was a day glow, like electric neon color. So the place that has the most things in that sort of color is basically like a Dick's Sporting Goods. And she takes him there and loses track of him at one point and turns around, and the person who is like helping people in the fitting rooms sees him as a tree wearing clothes. And Doreen is just like, God damn it. Because she had noticed Philip's disguise starting to get wonky. Somebody said something to him about how he walks like a dweeb, which I am sure that this sort of thing happens, but the idea of somebody just like yelling that you walk like a dweeb is just so like, ugh, people suck. So she felt like probably it was beginning to slip because Philip was tired. So she knew that there was some danger here. But what frustrated me a lot was that Philip doesn't seem to understand at all what's going on. He doesn't seem to understand, like, how important it is that he keep secret and be understated about everything. And it just really, like, I felt like she had made it really clear before they left. So I didn't understand why he's so puzzled at her reaction. And it just felt like I thought he got it when she explained initially. And he says something about, you know, like, your people must be easily shocked. And she's like, yeah. And from the way it sounds in the moment, it almost seems as if he completely turned his disguise off while trying the clothes on. Which, like, the only thing that I can think is that, was the sales guy meant to have just, like, pulled aside the curtain and, like, look in without permission and just caught Philip when he had his guard down? Because that does not feel like a thing that a sales guy would do. So I don't think that's what's going on. I'm trying to find this spot here. Sir, said the voice in the background, would you like some? And then came the shriek, and Doreen suddenly realized what she had been hearing. Let's see. The poor man was staring at something he had not seen in a changing room before. A Christmas tree wearing day-glow orange jams and several baseball caps, all brightly colored. The top one was on backwards. I like the root covers, Philip said thoughtfully, but I'm not entirely sure about the hat. So, yeah, it sounds like this guy did just, like, open the curtain, which is, like, highly questionable anyway. But yeah, and Yama is in the chat saying, how could she leave him by himself? And that's the other question. And she asks herself that pretty quickly. She's just like, what the fuck is wrong with me? Because he, to be fair, and like I said, I thought that he understood better, but there are some warning signs that he doesn't really get it. I just thought from before that he got it. And that he was trying to push his luck a little bit here, and that she set him straight, but evidently not. So, yeah, she throws an invisibility spell over him, and the dude who saw him is like, oh my god, I got really stoned at a party last night, and I think I did a little bit too much, and just sort of, like, backs out of the situation. And she goes up to the food court and is like, I'm going to be taking Philip home the direct way, so I'm going to meet you guys back at home. And that's the end of that chapter, and this is when we go into chapter 8. First, Nita's having a phone call with her dad, and she talks to him and to Doreen, and she gets the impression that things aren't going super well. There's no time, because Rashawn winds up, like, coming into the room pretty soon after her father brings up the subject. But there's no time for him to get into, like, detail about the problems that are happening. But it's clear something's going on. And when she's, like, relaying all of this later to Kit, she describes it as a personality conflict, which is very correct. And this phone call, like, you know, she asks for some SPF, and he's like, don't you have a spell that you can do? And she's like, yeah, but I forgot. And I was like, I mean, if you forget a spell, how are you going to just remember to, like, apply SPF? Like, for me, the spell is still the better option. And it's wild to me that she's even bothering with the lotion, but okay, sure. And Nita is just, or no, Doreen is so jealous of Nita because things are actually lovely where she is, which was initially, like, the point. But now, obviously, Nita, like, comes on and says, I'm on the record as saying this was a really, really stupid choice. So she breaks the connection, and she goes down and she talks to Kawilin, who is at the pen, and they talk a little bit about the sheep. She just goes on with calling them sheep. And by she, I mean Diane Duane. So I'm going to call them that as well. But let's see. There's an interesting part of the conversation here when his wife joins them. So, okay. Here it is, yeah. She came in at first meal. Oh, this is him talking about when Quelt found out that she was a wizard and when did you find out? And he says she just came in at first meal one morning and told us. I guess that would be a couple of 100 years ago now. 260, said Demare, coming out of the house and down to the pen with a jug and a cup of sepa for her husband. And Kit says, was that before her ordeal or after? Ordeal, Demare said. Oh, you mean the own choice? After, I suppose. Ordeal, is that what they call it in your world? Is it normally dangerous for you? So, what I'm getting from this is essentially that what it sounds like is that Quelt has not actually gone through an ordeal at all. Because of the decision that was made, it sounds like maybe she doesn't have to due to what's going on this planet. But I don't understand enough about how this works to really grasp how that could be. In that way, you usually wind up fighting with the lone power one way or another. And they don't know who that means. And Kit's like, invented entropy? Oh, that one. Certainly we know about her, but she's no problem. What? Like, you can just say that? And how come she's not? Kit said. Cywilyn and Demare looked at each other, perplexed again. I always assumed it had something to do with our species' choice, Cywilyn said. But I wouldn't be an expert. Quelt would know more about it, I'd imagined. So they go and find Quelt. And there's this moment, let's see. Maybe it had to do with the Alaalu species being so long-lived, but Nita wasn't entirely convinced. She's talking about how there's no feeling of a need to rush here. She kept remembering that dream image of a beach full of statues. Something else is going on. They caught up with her about half an hour later. She'd seen them and started walking toward them. Ponch reached her first, having run ahead to greet her. So she tells them a little bit about like what she's been instructed to do to get some more metal out of this vein in the planet. And Kit mentions like they had to be reminded who the lone power is. Is that usual here? And Kit's like, we would normally fight the lone power personally, and people in our world know it exists. But do you guys like how come your world is so perfect that people don't even seem to be like aware of it? What did you do? Because believe me, if we could have done the same kind of thing. Quelt's expression was somewhat bemused. Well, it would have something to do with and there's this word that I won't even attempt, the debate and decision. And she says you should probably come look at the display. We keep an enactment of it. That's one of my jobs as a wizard, to make sure the enactment is kept running. Even though most of us don't think about it a whole lot, I suppose we might as well go have a look. We've done some tourist things, but this one is so boring for most people, it never occurred to me to take you there. So, they use a wizardry to go to this spot where there is what looks like a pool of like water that's shining from what seems for a moment to be like a reflection off the surface of the water. And then it becomes clear very quickly that it's not water and it's actually like shining of its own accord. It's not reflecting anything. It's air held solid. You know the spell, I think. Come on, you can walk out on it. She led the way across the surface of the pool, strolling out as if onto a crystal floor. Nita and Kit followed, pausing with Quelt at about the middle of the surface to look down into the depths. There they saw 8 figures, male and female, plainly Alaaluds by their coloration, hair, and dress. 7 stood more or less together. The 8th one stood apart. And at this point, she's like, okay, we can go down in there. And they catch sight of this one particular woman, all but one who stood apart, and Alaalu taller than the rest, dressed in all white and coolly beautiful, with eyes of a gorgeous burning amber. Wow, Kit said. Who's that? Assembly, Quelt said. She's hot, Kit said, in considerable admiration. Nita threw a glance at him. Next to Kit, Paunch, too, was gazing down, but he was starting to growl. Kit looked at Paunch in shock, and then at Quelt. Oh, no, you mean she's the lone power, Nita said, the local version. That's her, Quelt said. But we came in the middle of the story. If you come over here, you can see it from the start. So they go down into the actual, like, so as if they're standing in amongst everybody. It's very reminiscent of like going to into somebody's memory in the Pensieve in Harry Potter. So they can feel like they're a part of it. Paunch, for his part, doesn't want to be involved. He would rather go out and chase birds and whatnot. And I feel like it's going to be significant that he wasn't here for this, but I don't know what that's going to look like. So the scenario repeats whenever anyone who sees it wants it to. Most people get taken here once or twice when we're little. I got to see it more often than most people, because Varric ran me through the choice a lot when he was training me as his replacement. There's not really a lot to it, but it is history, and something a wizard here would need to know about. So these were our wizards. That little one there, he's the chief, Cecil. He wrote out the first part of the telling. He wrote the words he heard the wind telling the water. All the others did that too, sooner or later, except they all heard different words. Cecil had to journey all over the settled lands from island to island to find other people who'd heard the words and could tell him the ones he didn't know. It took a long time to find them all, but he wouldn't give up. That's Imrar. The poem about the island journey, it got mentioned in one of the orientation sources. It took him 300 years, and he had all kinds of adventures, but he found all the words at last. And let's see. I've heard many a strange tale on my travels, Cecil said. Let's see. They were confused. This is right before it starts. This is still Quelt talking. They were confused about her because she plainly knew about wizardry, though she wasn't a wizard. So then Cecil, we begin to hear him talking from inside of this thing. This is one of the stranger ones. What is it exactly that you're offering us? It doesn't sound like anything new, said another of the wizards. This is the world, and entropy is running. We have time and life to live in it. But not in power, Iktaniki said. I'm going to just say the lone power from here on. Not in power you can depend upon. You sailed the seas from inner to outer and back again, finding a word here and a word there, hoping the wind would bring you what you need to know. Why should you be at the world's mercy this way? With help from someone wise, someone longer in the world, you can find your power much more quickly. I can help you do that. The Alaalu wizards looked at one another, not quite sure what to make of this. Help is always welcome, one of them said. But you must pay my price, the lone one said. The uncertainty among them grew. Nita saw several of them exchange glances, and in particular Cecil began to regard her with what looked like the beginnings of suspicion. Among us, when one person needs something, another one gladly gives it to them. That way, you know when the day comes you need something, another will be ready to give. If you have a gift to give us, we'll accept it gladly, assuming it's a thing we need. But this talk of price... So the lone one at this point is basically like, yeah, that's really cute and everything, but like most of the universe is not like that, and you should probably get a handle on the fact that you could have anybody land on your shores and just demand shit from you, because that's how a lot of other societies function. And interestingly, the lone one says adult beings conduct their affairs in the worlds beyond your world, which I feel like is like simultaneously intriguing and maybe a little insulting, implying that they are not adult beings somehow. Go the way I will show you, and you too will do your business among the worlds in such a way as to impress all with your wisdom and power. But you should also know that not all beings in the world conduct their business in such a kindly way. I can teach you these things. And how is it you know about that in the first place? Cecil said. You speak confidently of worlds beyond our world and prices to be paid, as if our way of giving and accepting were a trap. Nor do any of us know you or where you come from. I think any advice you might have to give should be looked at with care. Nita watched and saw how most of the wizards drew together towards Cecil, but one or two stood off to the side, regarding the lone one with curiosity, if not interest. And one of them, an Alaalu with long red hair hanging down below his shoulders, moved a little way towards her and said, "What exactly would your price be?" And as soon as it says, like, their red hair is hanging down, I was like, wait. And then immediately, Nita recognizes this dude as being the one in her dream. And I was like, yeah, okay, good. Because I was sort of wondering. The lone one's smile grew somber. It's as you've said, entropy is indeed running. But with my price, you can buy yourselves an exemption. Around you, you see what happens to the rest of the world. Even the mountains are worn away in time. All life ends. But for you, for the wise, it doesn't have to be this way. There are ways to go on, to reject the fate of the material things around you. If I help you, you can have life and then cheat death. The wizard with the long red hair looked thoughtfully at her. And Kelt says, that's Dhruva. He was one of the oldest of the wizards. You can tell by his hair. Let's see. You still haven't said what your price would be, Dhruva said. It's only a little thing. I know the one who brought entropy into being. For those who are that one's friends, there are privileges and rewards. One of them is to circumvent the waste and pain that comes with age. A people who make this bargain have no need of watching the strength and joy of youth slip slowly away. It's theirs forever. They have an eternity to grow from power to power, and if they so desire it, more than an eternity. They can go onward into the time beyond times, in their own bodies in the flesh. To do so, of course, they must take entropy's inventor as their master, not some impersonal wind. The relationship is far more rewarding, more personal. And Cecil says, but is it more free? And at first I thought he meant free like, freedom. But then he says, those who speak in terms of prices themselves will do nothing for nothing. And I realized that he meant like free, like we ain't got to pay for what we got now, though. And I was like, oh, shit, that's a much more literal meaning. So the wind has spoken the name of one of the powers that lives in the dead calm, in the sun that beats down and parches the dry isles and dries up everything that would grow. We want nothing to do with that power or its gifts. And the wizards began to argue. Nita sighed because she had heard various versions of this argument since she'd become a wizard. And Quote says, it goes on for a while. Do you want to skip ahead? And they say, sure. The lone one and Dhruva were walking back toward the main group now, and the others watched them come, Cecil watching most carefully. To Cecil, Dhruva said, she told me a great many things, and I'm convinced we should give her suggestions a more careful hearing. Cecil's face was calm, but in his eyes, Nita thought she saw signs of the first anger she had seen in an Alaalu. I feel no such need, nor I think does anyone else here. We want nothing of her exemption. Through her voice the dead calm speaks, and there is no good in that. We will cast her out, we will wall her out of this world, and henceforth we will take our chances with the winds. The other 5 wizards in the circle with Cecil held up their hands against her in a gesture of rejection. She began to be battered back away from them as if the wind was actually blowing her from the circle, though in the grass around there was no sign of it, and only the slightest breeze stirred the flowers. Nita held her breath, waiting for the storm to break, but to her surprise, nothing happened. Dhruva stood there and watched her being forced away, and finally turned his back on the lone power. But then he also turned away from the older wizards and began walking off through the flowers. "You will call me back before the end of things," she said, and looked warningly around. "You think you're acting in virtue, but you're acting in ignorance, and though you are swift in decision now, you will have long to repent it." "Never," Cecil said. "We want nothing to do with you. Take yourself away and do not bother us again." In the act of being forced away, she raised her hands. Nita winced. "Here it comes. I bet now we find out why this planet has what looks like a really big impact crater." But she simply let her hands fall and stopped resisting the spell, turning and walking away from them the way Dhruva went, not hurrying. Slowly she vanished into the dazzle of the day and was gone from sight a long time before she came anywhere near that impossibly distant horizon. "That was it?" he said. "That was it," Quelch said. "Should there have been more?" "Well, not necessarily, but I've seen choices that took a little longer." Nita looked around again with some confusion. "This is kind of strange," she said. "The way Dhruva was acting, unless I'm misunderstanding, it's more like the kind of thing the lone one would do. Are you sure he wasn't overshadowed?" "What happened to him afterward?" Kit said. "He left. The reasons given differ, and he did say he didn't care for the way the choice had been made. Some versions of the story tell how Dhruva said he didn't want anything more to do with his own people. They say he threatened the other wizards and said to them something like what she had said, that they couldn't make this choice without him, or that later they'd wish they'd listened to him and that someday they'd need him back and wouldn't be able to find him. But all the stories agree that he went away from the place where he lived and was never seen there again." This is super weird. I genuinely do not know what to make of this. There are other stories that say how sometimes people would see him for a day, an hour, on some lonely road, or climbing a mountain, or sailing by himself on the sea, always looking for something, always acting as if something was missing, but it wasn't thought lucky to see him. He was tricky to talk to, didn't always make sense, or you might hear his voice behind first one tree and then another in the forest, always moving in front of you when you got close, never staying where you thought he was. There's even one story that says he went wandering right out of the world, among other worlds, looking for whatever he was missing. It doesn't really matter in terms of the choice. It's made now, and pretty well made, I think. So, what on earth? So, this is also when they bring up, so what's going on with people who die here? And Nita says, "There have been times I woke up in the middle of the night and thought I heard people whispering." Quelch looked at Nita and nodded. "That's right. I thought you'd probably be able to hear them. When we die, we don't die out of the world. We die into it. The people who were here are always around." And Quelch looked at Nita with a little less certainty than usual, an expression a little less serene. "It's not like that for you in your world, is it?" Nita shook her head. "No," she said, and couldn't keep the sadness out of her voice. "Definitely not." What is happening? What is this? I don't understand. Let's see. Yama says, "This is what I don't get. The lone power said you can cheat death. They say no, it leaves, but now the people there basically don't die. I'm confused." Yeah, this is what makes me think that Dhruva did something. The fact that they don't die, for me, means that Dhruva made some sort of weird attempt at a deal that is accomplishing they're not dying, but instead they're trapped in something that's like worse, if that makes sense. And that he's realizing that like not allowing them to just die isn't doing them any good or any sort of service. That's my guess, is that he tried to do something on behalf of his people and has wound up fucking it up. But yeah, I don't know. And then Yama says he's looking for Nita. Maybe. I was thinking that, like, you know, I wouldn't know if he was looking for somebody specific or if he was just looking for somebody who can help him undo this. And that would also make sense why it seems like Quelt didn't have to go through an ordeal. You know, like Quelt is just exempt from that because of the deal that he made without the permission of the rest of his people. I don't know how that's allowed. That's the thing that I don't really understand. But yeah, I don't really know how this is like, how all of this shakes out, but I'm super curious about it. This is a very like complex feeling storyline. I just keep being impressed with her being Diane Duane. She's just like, I can't believe her work doesn't get more notice. I just, you know, she deserves more people to read her shit, and she also deserves audiobooks that match up with the chapters in the Kindle book. But yeah, I am just so like, this obviously couldn't have gone down the way it looks like it did for things to work the way they do here. Some part of this story is missing for sure, and being hidden from everybody somehow. And how is that, like, how does that work? I don't know. I don't have any more theories. Just like what I asserted is that thinking that Dhruva is somehow responsible, and that those people that Nita saw in her dream are dead and somehow trapped somewhere. That's as close as I can get to like any sort of well-formulated hypothesis. So, all right. So I'm going to have to wrap up, but thank you again to Patricia for commissioning this episode. I hope that you guys are enjoying the coverage. It's fun for this to be kind of a mystery, this episode, you know, or not this episode, this book. 'Cause a lot of them, it's much more of an adventure story, but this feels like, as much as it is an adventure, it does still feel like there's a puzzle. And I just always enjoy when an author sets up a puzzle in this way, when it's not like a super common thing for them to do, because it means that they've thought things through, usually pretty carefully. So I'm looking forward to what happens. All right. Well, I'm going to wrap. Thank you, Yama, for hanging out in the chat. Appreciate you. She's telling me to check my email. Will do, I promise. And I will see you guys soon with a new episode. Until then, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.